The rain hammered against the taxi windows as James carefully maneuvered through the dark streets downtown. His wrinkled fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to ignore the envelope in the pocket of his worn-out jacket, which held the savings of a lifetime. After 40 years as a taxi driver, this was supposed to be his last night of work. Sarah, his wife, needed to start her cancer treatment next week, and every penny would be necessary. The radio crackled softly, broadcasting news about the worsening storm, when a frantic knock on the car window startled him. A pregnant young woman, soaked by the rain, practically threw herself into the back seat. Her large, brown, terrified eyes met his in the rear-view mirror. "Central Hospital, please," she whispered, clutching her belly. "Quick." James observed her pale face through the mirror. She couldn't be more than 25, and her hands trembled as she tried to wipe the rain from her face with the wet sleeves of her coat. "Are you all right?" he asked, turning up the heater. She only nodded, squeezing her eyes shut. James recognized that kind of silence. It was the same Sarah kept when trying to hide her pain. He sped up. His eyes split between the slippery road and the increasingly pale young woman in the back seat. They were halfway to the hospital when he heard a muffled groan through the rear-view mirror. He saw the young woman pass out, her body collapsing onto the seat. James's heart raced. He couldn't lose anyone else, not after seeing his son die in his arms 15 years ago, a victim of a similar accident on a rainy night like this one. Without hesitation, he made a sharp turn toward the nearest emergency room. The vision of his son blended with the image of the unconscious woman, and his hands trembled as he braked abruptly at the emergency entrance. "Help! I need help here," he shouted, his hoarse voice echoing in the lobby as he carried the young woman in his arms. The medical team acted swiftly, placing her on a stretcher. "She's 8 months pregnant." The doctor said after a quick examination, "We need to perform an emergency C-section. There's a placenta abruption." "She doesn't have any identification," the nurse said. "We need a guardian to authorize the procedure and cover the initial costs." James felt the weight of the envelope in his pocket. There was the entire future for Sarah, all the chances to fight the disease that was consuming her. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering her smile that morning, so full of hope as she talked about the treatment they would start. "How much?" he asked, his voice cracking. When the nurse mentioned the amount, the world spun around him. It was exactly the sum he had saved for Sarah's treatment. His hands shook as he pulled the envelope from his pocket, but his heart knew there was no choice. Sarah would understand. She had always been the most compassionate person he knew. "Here," he said, handing over the envelope. "Save them. Please save them both." As he signed the authorization papers, a solitary tear rolled down his wrinkled face. In his mind, he saw Sarah smile, knowing that, even if it meant starting over from scratch, he was doing the right thing. Some choices go beyond money, beyond reason. They are choices that define who we truly are. James remained in the hospital, his back slumped against the cold wall of the waiting room. The smell of antiseptic reminded him of the countless visits with Sarah during her early exams, when the diagnosis was still an undefined shadow hanging over their lives. Now, as he waited for news about the young stranger, his hands caressed his gold wedding band, worn by time, a ritual that calmed him in moments of the deepest anxiety. An older nurse, with kind eyes and gray hair, approached him with a cup of hot coffee. "You should go home and rest," she said, her voice heavy with genuine concern. "The surgery will take a few more hours." "I can't," James replied, accepting the coffee with a tired smile. "I promised I'd stay until I know they're all right." The nurse, who introduced herself as Rose, sat next to him. In her 30 years of service, few cases had touched her as much as seeing the old taxi driver give up his savings to save a stranger. During her break, she stayed there, listened to James talk about Sarah, about how they met in a diner where she worked as a waitress nearly 40 years ago. "She spilled coffee on my uniform on the first day," he said, a nostalgic gleam in his eyes. And instead of getting angry when I complained, she laughed and said she was doing me a favor because that tie was awful. Rose smiled, noticing how his face lit up when he talked about his wife. James continued, revealing how Sarah always put others first, how she had a special gift for making people feel welcome. "She'll understand why I did this," he said, more to himself than to Rose. "Sarah always says that life has its own way of testing our humanity." The hours dragged on. James told Rose about his son, Thomas, and how his loss had left a void that would never be filled. "Sometimes," he confessed, his voice breaking, "when I pick up young passengers late at night, I can't help but think of him, of how I should have stopped him from driving that night in the storm." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway. A tall man, dressed in an elegant suit that contrasted with the humble surroundings of the public hospital, arrived accompanied by security guards. His expression was a mix of panic and authority. "My wife, Elizabeth Bennett. They brought her here a few hours ago." His voice resonated through the corridor. Rose stood up quickly, recognizing the name. "Mr. Bennett, your wife is in surgery. Please follow me." James watched as Rose explained the situation to the man, seeing his expression change from concerned confusion upon learning that a taxi driver had saved his wife and child. Mr. Bennett looked in his direction, his eyes studying the old taxi driver with an unsettling intensity. At that moment, James felt the weight of his choices more than ever. In a few hours, he would go home and have to explain to Sarah why they couldn't start treatment next week. His heart ached. Even as he imagined her expression, something inside him was at peace. That night, he had been the kind of man Sarah had always believed him to be, someone who placed compassion above fear and humanity above circumstances. The hospital corridor plunged into a tense silence as William Bennett approached James. His firm steps contrasted with the worn floor, each measured movement revealing years of power and influence. Yet there was something different in his eyes, a vulnerability that his expensive clothes could not hide. "You saved my wife," William said, his usually commanding voice now trembling slightly. "And my child." He paused, studying the taxi driver's weathered face. "Why?" Before James could answer, Rose hurried back, her features tight with concern. "Mr. Bennett, we need to talk," she said. She hesitated, glancing at James. "Actually, it's best that you stay too." In the small meeting room, the air heavy with worry, Rose explained that Elizabeth had briefly regained consciousness during the surgery. In that moment of lucidity, she revealed something that would change everything. She had been fleeing her home when she got into your taxi. She discovered something. Rose continued, her words carefully chosen. "Something about your business, Mr. Bennett. Documents that proved..." She paused, selecting her words. "The misappropriation of funds from the children's hospital your company runs." William slumped into a chair, his entire authoritative posture collapsing. James watched as a man now appeared smaller, more fragile, his hands trembling as he covered his face. "I was going to tell her," William murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "After the baby was born, I was going to explain that I was returning everything, that I had realized my mistake." He looked at James, his eyes brimming. "Elizabeth volunteered at that hospital for years. It was her life's work. When she found out..." William's voice faltered. James felt a familiar pain in his chest, the same he had carried since losing Thomas. The weight of wrong choices, the desperate wish to turn back time. "The money," William continued, "is already being returned. I started the process 2 weeks ago, but Elizabeth found the old documents before I could explain. She hasn't answered my calls for days." His hands trembled as he pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. "I thought she was at her sister's, trying to process everything. I never imagined that." The moment was interrupted by a young doctor who entered the room, his serious expression barely concealing an urgent tension. "Mr. Bennett, we need you immediately. There's been a complication." The words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud. James felt his heart tighten, remembering the night he lost Thomas, how the doctor's words had shattered his world in seconds. "Your wife is experiencing severe bleeding," the doctor explained, his professional tone barely hiding the gravity of the situation. "The baby is stable, but Elizabeth—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We need your authorization for an emergency procedure. There are no guarantees, but it's her only chance." James watched the exact moment when William Bennett's world crumbled, a look he knew all too well. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning when thinking of Thomas, the same look he dreaded seeing on Sarah's face when the treatment could no longer begin. In the waiting room, James observed William Bennett pacing back and forth, his steps marking the rhythm of their shared anguish. The businessman had removed his expensive jacket, and his loosened tie revealed a man stripped of his layers of power, reduced to his bare essence. A husband desperate not to lose his wife, a father anxious to meet his child. "She always wanted children," William murmured, breaking the heavy silence. His words carried the weight of unspoken memories. "We went through 3 losses before this pregnancy. Elizabeth never gave up, but I—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "I lost myself in work, in numbers, convincing myself that I was building a better future for our family." In that moment, James recognized something familiar, the same regret he had carried since the night Thomas died. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we lose ourselves trying to protect those we love." William sat down beside James, his hands trembling as he held a small USB drive. "Here is a complete truth about the misappropriations at the hospital. Elizabeth was right to want to expose everything." He looked at the drive as if it were both poison and antidote. "I started returning the money 2 weeks ago, but it wasn't just about the money. It was about who I had become." Their silence was broken when Rose entered with hurried steps. "Mr. Bennett, your wife is stabilized, but—" She hesitated, her gentle eyes revealing deep concern. "The next moments will be crucial. She asked for you." Before William could stand, James grasped his arm. "Mr. Bennett." His voice was firm, laden with wisdom earned through pain. "Don't wait to say what needs to be said. Believe me, some regrets are too heavy to carry." In the corridor leading to the ICU, William suddenly stopped. He turned to James, his eyes reflecting a decision made. "Please stay. You saved my family twice today, once with your courage, and now with your wisdom." James thought of Sarah, of how she always said there are no coincidences, only encounters meant to transform our souls. As he followed William down the antiseptic corridor, he felt the weight of the now empty envelope in his pocket, a reminder of the sacrifice he had made. But now, that emptiness was beginning to fill with something unexpected. The chance to help someone avoid making the same mistakes he had, the opportunity to turn his own loss into a beacon of hope for another family. In the room, Elizabeth lay pale against white sheets, tubes and monitors surrounding her fragility. Beside her, in a small incubator, her newborn son fought his own battle for life. The scene was a painful reminder of how life and death eternally dance a delicate waltz, and how every moment of choice can change the course of that dance forever. Elizabeth slowly opened her eyes, her gaze first meeting William's worried face, then focusing on James, who remained quietly close to the door. A small smile touched her pale lips as she extended her trembling hand toward the taxi driver. "You remind me so much of my father." Her voice was barely a whisper. He was also a taxi driver. He always said that every passenger carried a story that deserved to be heard. The revelation hit James like a soft blow to the chest. William, sitting next to his wife, held her hand delicately, as if fearing she might fade away at any moment. "When I found the documents," Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining strength, "I couldn't bear it. It wasn't just about the money. It was about all the children in the hospital, about the promises I made to them." Her eyes filled with tears. "My father died without being able to pay for his cancer treatment. The hospital where he should have been treated had closed due to lack of funds." William let out a contained sob, years of guilt weighing on his shoulders. I started giving everything back, he said, his voice choking. But you were right to want to expose me. I lost my way, Elizabeth. I became exactly the kind of person your father fought against his whole life. James felt the weight of the empty envelope in his pocket. Thinking of Sarah and her postponed treatment, life had a peculiar way of intertwining destinies, of creating invisible connections between seemingly different people. Mr. James, Elizabeth called softly. When I got into your taxi, I was headed to the newspaper office. I had all the evidence with me. She paused, breathing heavily. But something in your kindness, in your concerned look to the rearview mirror, made me realize there might be another way. Rose entered the room, pushing a small incubator. Does anyone want to meet the little miracle? Her gentle smile lit up the tense atmosphere. The baby was tiny, but his clenched fist showed surprising strength. Elizabeth reached out to touch the acrylic separating her from her child. Her tears now joy mixed with regret. James, she said, we wanted to ask your permission to give our son your name. James Thomas Bennett. Her voice trembled as she continued. Rose told us about your son, about the night you lost him, and about your wife, Sarah. William stood up, approaching James with a flash drive in his hand. It's not just his name. I want to turn the Children's Hospital into a foundation, one that honors the memory of your son and Elizabeth's father, a place where no family has to choose between saving a life and paying for treatment. James felt his legs weaken, memories of Thomas blending with the image of the tiny baby in the incubator. Rose quickly brought a chair, her gentle hands guiding him to sit. Your sacrifice tonight, William continued, showed me the man I should have been, the man I can still become. Little James Thomas opened his eyes for the first time that night, his tiny hands flailing in the air as if trying to reach something beyond the incubator. James watched the scene through the neonatal ICU glass. His heart overflowed with emotions he couldn't name. Beside him, William remained silent, both of them witnessing the miracle of life they had fought so hard to preserve. The baby had the same curious eyes as Elizabeth, a small light of hope in the darkness of the night that had brought them together. I need to call Sarah, James said softly, remembering his wife waiting at home. His hands caressed the phone in his pocket, wondering about the worry in her voice. She must be awake, waiting for news. William touched his shoulder gently, a gesture that carried the weight of newfound gratitude and understanding. Use my phone. And please, tell her a car is already on the way to pick her up. Actually, he paused, his eyes revealing a decision made. I asked them to bring all her tests too. I have some friends who are specialists and can help with the treatment. James dialed a familiar number, his hands trembling slightly. Sarah's voice answered on the first ring, the worry evident in every word. As he explained the events of the night, he felt tears rolling down his wrinkled face. Sarah listened in silence, her soft breath on the other end of the line a constant reminder of her unconditional love. You did the right thing, my love, Sarah said, her voice full of love and understanding. As you always do. Since the day we met, you've never hesitated to help someone in need. That's why I fell in love with you. Minutes later, Elizabeth asked to see James again. Her face was rosier, a renewed strength shining in her eyes. The ICU room, once cold and impersonal, seemed more welcoming with her presence. I found this in my bag, she said, extending a crumpled, time-worn envelope. These are the last photos I took with my father before he left. He always said he would one day find someone who would show me that there are still people like him in the world. James carefully opened the envelope as if handling a precious treasure. His heart stopped for a moment when his eyes fell on the first photograph, on the yellow paper. A man smiled beside a young Elizabeth, both in front of an old taxi. It was the same smile Thomas had, the same sparkle in the eyes that James saw every morning in the mirror. The memory hit him like a gentle wave of recognition. Your father, James whispered, his voice choked with emotion. George Miller. He worked at the old taxi cooperative downtown, didn't he? Elizabeth nodded, surprised, her eyes widening with recognition. "How do you know? Did you know my father?" "He taught me everything I know," James replied, the memories flowing like a gentle river. "He was my mentor when I started 40 years ago. He taught me that being a taxi driver wasn't just about taking people from one place to another, but about carrying their stories, their fears, their hopes." He paused, a soft smile touching his lips. "He was the one who helped me buy my first taxi, who lent me the money for the down payment when no bank believed in me." The room fell silent, filled only with the soft sound of monitors and the weight of shared memories. William watched the scene, finally understanding the true meaning of family and legacy. Life's coincidences wove a delicate web of connections that transcended time and space. "The Children's Hospital," William said, his voice firm with determination, breaking the reverent silence. "It will be renamed in honor of your father, Elizabeth. George Miller Children's Hospital. And James," he paused, searching for the right words, "I want you to be part of the board of directors. We need people who understand the true value of life, who carry within them the wisdom that your mentor left us as a legacy." At that moment, Rose entered the room, pushing a wheelchair. Sarah was in it, her eyes shining with tears of joy at seeing her husband. Even after so many years, the love between them illuminated the room with its silent strength. James rushed to hug her, feeling the familiar scent of her hair, the strength of her love that had always guided him through the darkest nights. "I came to meet our new family," Sarah said softly, looking at Elizabeth and the baby in the incubator. Her voice carried the same gentleness that had made her so special to James from the very first day. "And to say that some choices are blessed by fate. Some stormy nights bring more than rain. They bring miracles disguised as coincidences." 3 months later, the afternoon sun shone through the newly installed stained glass windows of the George Miller Children's Hospital, painting the hallway with soft colors. James walked beside Sarah, their hands intertwined as always. Her treatment was progressing well, thanks to the specialist William had arranged, and her strength grew every day, like the flowers in the small garden Elizabeth had created in the hospital courtyard. Little James Thomas, now out of the incubator, slept peacefully in Elizabeth's arms as she led the board meeting. Her voice, once hesitant when discovering William's wrongdoings, now carried the confidence of someone who had found their true purpose. The walls of the room displayed old photographs. Among them, the image of her father next to his taxi, a constant reminder of the legacy of compassion that now guided that place. "Thanks to the assistance program we implemented," Elizabeth explained, adjusting the baby in her arms, "no family will have to choose between treatment and survival. Every child will have the chance my father never had." Her eyes met James's, sharing a silent understanding. William, sitting beside her, was no longer the cold businessman he once was. The transformation in his face was visible, the weight of guilt replaced by the determination to make a difference. His hands, once busy with profit spreadsheets, now held reports of lives transformed. "James," William called, standing up, "we have a surprise for you and Sarah." He signaled, and Rose entered the room, pushing a small stretcher. It was a little boy no more than 6 years old, smiling shyly, his eyes shining with renewed hope. "This is Michael," Rose explained, her voice soft. "He arrived last week, needing the same treatment Sarah did. Thanks to the new program, he's already started therapy." The boy waved, his smile lighting up the room. He asked if he could meet the taxi driver who helped change the hospital. Sarah squeezed James's hand, silent tears running down her face. Here was the living proof that the choice they made that stormy night had created waves of transformation that would continue far beyond them. "You know, Michael," James said, approaching the boy, "a long time ago, I learned that sometimes we need to lose something precious to find an even greater treasure." He took the old photograph of George Miller out of his pocket. "This man taught me that every person we meet is a story waiting to be discovered, a miracle waiting to happen." Elizabeth approached, little James Thomas now awake, his curious eyes watching the scene. "And some stories," she added, "are like shooting stars. They appear when we least expect them, lighting our way on the darkest nights." Sarah, now stronger after months of treatment, stood up from her chair without help. "True wealth," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had known both despair and hope, "isn't in what we keep for ourselves, but in what we share with others." The sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold. In the hospital garden, a simple yet elegant plaque shone with golden letters. "George Miller Children's Hospital, where every life is a story of hope." Below, in smaller letters, a touching message, "In memory of Thomas, son of James and Sarah, whose loss inspired a legacy of love and compassion." James looked out the window, watching the families arrive and depart, each carrying their own story of struggle and hope. That stormy night, he had lost his savings, but gained something much more precious. The chance to turn his pain into healing, his sacrifice into hope, his loss into a legacy that would continue to touch lives long after the last raindrop had dried. Dear friends, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. Your words inspire us to continue bringing stories that move and transform. To not miss our next narratives, subscribe to the Soul and History channel and activate the bell. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that make a difference. See you at the next story.